Hi everyone, it's Pete here. Now welcome to part 3 of my build guide of the Tamiya Subaru Brat. At the end of part 2 I'd just done step 16 where I've got the rear springs on. So I need to move on to step 17 where I'm attaching the pinion to the motor. Okay, so rather unusually on this kit there's only one mounting position for the motor, and the way you get different gear ratios with this is to have different spur gears with different pinion gears. And they give you a choice of 3 sets. I've gone for the highest gear ratio, so it's the smallest spur gear, which is the 49 tooth PG3, and I need the biggest pinion, which is the 19 tooth MD6. So we just need to put this motor plate on first. So they're saying there's a distance of 16.5mm between the end of the gear and the plate of the motor. So I'm going to get it sort of roughly right, and then I'll offer it up to the spur gear in the gearbox and see how the mesh looks. Okay, I just got the little BC4 grub screw on the end of the Allen key there. I'll just put a little bit of this thread lock on just to make sure it doesn't shake loose. And yeah, let's put it into the pinion. So I'm making sure it's on the flat part of the spindle there. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just to offer that up to the spur gear in the gearbox and see how good the mesh is. Okay, I can just see that it's not quite far enough onto the teeth of the spur gear there, so I'm just going to bring it out by 1mm or so. Run the end of that over, just check, and I think that is absolutely spot on. So I shall tighten up the grub screw properly. So step 18 looks pretty simple. We're attaching the motor and this cap onto the gearbox with these 30mm long screws, and then we're attaching this A1 part, which is part of the battery holder, onto there with these self-tapping screws. Okay, so the A1 part attaches to the side of the chassis there with the BA2 screws, and also I've noticed that there's the same on the other side in step 19, so we might as well do that now as well. Now step 19 has got us putting in the steering servo, the ESC and the receiver. One thing I've noticed is it answers the question as to why this piece isn't in a fixed position, and it's because this is what you attach the steering servo to. The steering servos aren't all the same size, so also it's helpful to move that just as you get that in there. So yeah, that's that question answered. Okay, I was rummaging through my spare parts and I found this speed controller here, Tamiya TEU 104BK. It's a bit slimmer than the TBLE 02 one. The only advantage to the TBLE 02 is if you want to use a censored brushless system. This one's for brushed motors only, but that's what I've got, so that's fine. Now, one advantage using a Tamiya ESC and a Tamiya kit is that the switch is the right size and shape, and it's got the screws in the right place for the switch holder that they give you. If you have a look at this switch on this other ESC, it's not the right size. It's got holes there, but yeah, it's not designed to go into the switch holder that they give you. I'm using this receiver. It's a Fly Sky FSGR3E, I think that says, and that goes with the Fly Sky FSGT2 here. Very cheap, no problems with these. What I tend to do is to just buy a new receiver and have one transmitter that can run several cars, so you haven't got a room full of transmitters. Also, these are exactly the same as these E-tronic Pulse. They're interchangeable, so you can bind this receiver to that and vice versa with a Pulse receiver and Fly Sky transmitter. I've waterproofed the receiver with glue from a hot glue gun. I've done a video about that on my channel, and also I've waterproofed the ESC here as well, so we should have no bother in puddles. Just having a look at where the receiver goes according to the instructions, and if you have a look on the car here, it's this bit of plastic that goes across there, and it's not got a very good surface area to stick something down to. And the other problem I can see with that is right at the bottom of the car, and if you haven't waterproofed this, then the first puddle you go through is going to die. And also, even if you have waterproofed it, then you're going to have mud and that going all in your plugs there. So if you are planning to put it down at the bottom there, then I'd probably put it inside a balloon and cable tie it up so it'll be waterproof and dustproof. But what I'm going to do is, I've noticed there's this area up here, and I'm going to stick it up there and have the aerial coming up through here. And what I'm going to do, I think, is to get a bit of aerial tube and sort of glue it in here, so you have the aerial coming up there. I've noticed on the body the driver sits on the left of the car, so there's plenty of space on the right for the aerial to come up here, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so before I attach anything, I'm just checking all the wires can reach where they need to go, and that's fine. The switch goes in there, the receiver there, so that's fine. I shall start attaching everything. If you did have a big old-fashioned analog receiver like this one, you could still put it up here. I mean, I don't know who still uses an analog receiver in this day and age. I think it would mark them out as a madman. But yeah, that would still go up there. And then the idea with the long aerial is that this metal pole here attaches to the side of the car, and then you wrap the wire around it, and you could still do that if the receiver was up here. We need to stick the ESC onto the side of the steering servo there. I tend to use this car number plate tape. Get this off eBay. I think it's a bit stronger than what they give you in the kit. We need to attach the steering servo to the chassis. We're using these little BA4 screws that have got an integrated washer. Okay, so that's all secure there. I've routed the servo cable back through the chassis. I think I need to do the same with these ESC cables, just so they're sort of tied in. They just run through the chassis back to the receiver here. Okay, so we've got all these wires here where they need to be. These ones I'm going to leave poking up the top here because that's going to the battery, and that goes back to the motor there. Just having a look at how I might have the aerial so that it's poking up. To be honest, you could just drill a hole in there, stick the aerial up through, because it doesn't really matter with these 2.4 gigahertz systems as to whether the aerial's pointing straight up in the air. They've got an enormous range anyway. But you could just sort of glue it up, or you could get your aerial tube and sort of glue that in, just drill a hole through there, glue that in. What I found is this little thing here, which is a mount for a LED light. So what I was going to do is mount that into there, just drill a hole through, then just going to glue the aerial tube into that, and then thread the wire up through that so it is sticking up and it shouldn't flop about inside the chassis. Right, so I've got somewhere for the aerial to go. Now let's put the receiver in. Okay, so that should do for that. I've had second thoughts about the battery cable and the motor cable there, so I've run them under that bar there so that they go more through the middle of the chassis, and I can cable tie them on up here. We need to attach the switch holder A7 to the side of the chassis with a couple of these BA4 screws. To install the switch, you need to take the screws out of the switch there. You need to use these longer screws, which are the BC3s. You need a couple of washers, which are the BA6s. You need this plate here, which is the A4. They've got the switch coming in from underneath like that. What I'm thinking about that is it's going to be more difficult to get hold of the switch once the body's on top of there. Also, this wire is a bit prone to being knocked by rocks underneath there on the bottom of the switch. So what I'm going to do is put the switch in that way up, and then you've only got the little end of the switch poking through, and it's protected by that rubber cover anyway, and so it'd be easier to get at, and I think there's less things to be hit by rocks underneath. Okay, so that's it for step 19. Step 20, we need the MR5 rod ends there, and we need the MR9 and the MR10 rods. So we're just putting the ends onto the rods. They show us how far on to put them, so we can always adjust it later if necessary. So they're showing the end facing down like that. So, tighten that one a bit too much. Like that, so we can always adjust it once it's on the car. Okay, that looks near enough. Now step 21, we need to power up the radio gear because we need to centralise the servo before we put the servo horn on. We need to choose a suitable screw for the servo that we've got, so I'm just going to get a battery. Now the steering one goes in channel 1, the ESC cable goes into channel 2. These Tamiya ones have this extra plug here as a power lead, goes into that one there. Alright, let's power it on. Okay, so we've got power. Just switch the radio on. Okay, so let's recognise the radio. Let's try the steering. That's working. Just plug the motor in and just check that as well. So I think it's yellow to yellow, green to blue with this one. Soon find out. So forwards is forwards, backwards is backwards. We've got brake. Okay, so that all seems to work okay. Okay, we need to get the servo into its central position or neutral position before we put the servo horn on. To show you my radio here, I think most digital radio have similar sort of buttons on it. So this has got a steering rate, which is the amount it goes in each direction. So I'm just going to put that on maximum for now. Might have to adjust it later if the wheels are catching on anything. It's got a trim there, so I'm going to put the trim in the centre. Got a throttle trim on there, so if it's running when the throttle's in neutral, you might have to adjust that one. It's got a steering normal and reverse, so if the steering is steering the opposite way to the way that you're turning the wheel, then you might have to do that. It's also got a throttle normal and reverse. So if it's going forwards when you want backwards, or backwards when you want forwards, you might have to reverse that. Servo horn's made up of S1 there, S3, S6 and either S4 or S7, depending on which one fits on your particular servo. You need to work out which screw to use for your particular servo. So there's the BB6, the BC2 or the BE2. The one I've got here is a metal gear servo, and it's got a machine thread, 3mm machine thread, so it's this one, which is the BB6. So you're never going to use the self-tapper if you've got metal gear servo, it's always going to be a machine thread. So if you've got a plastic gear servo, then the self-tapper might be the one. So these servo screws can work loose because they're getting jolted about a lot, so if it's metal to metal, which this is, I'm going to put a tiny bit of thread lock on that to stop it working loose. If it's into plastic, then don't. This stuff eats plastic, but say metal to metal, it's fine. So I need to attach these bits together. That, and then we need to get these steering arms on. So it's the short one on this side because it's nearest to the edge of the car, and then that one like that. Right, so I'm going to put that on the servo as centrally as I can. That's most central I can get it onto the splines. So then you have this little washer there and a screw. So I'll just put a bit of thread lock on that. This is supposed to act as a spring to protect the servo from the jolts of the steering, so it's worth checking that the spring is working. So if you look there, You can see that the halves sort of come apart and then go back to the centre. Yeah, so that's working fine. Okay, so just attach the ends of the steering here. Okay, so the wheels, they sort of look about right. I think there's supposed to be slight toe in on this car. So let's just switch on and make sure that is working. So I think it's straining the steering slightly at one end, so it's going to turn the dual rate down a little bit. That was sort of touching on there a little bit, but just turned it down a little way. Seems fine. So also in this step we've got this bar MR7 goes across the top there and it's held in with these screws, the BB6s. I'm thinking this is another reason not to put the receiver right down inside the car because it would make it very difficult to get at. Just going to tie the cables up with a cable tie. So I've just left the ESC plug there loose, so I think it's going to be easier when the body's on to put the battery on. If you can pull that down there, you can plug it in and then push that back and tuck it in under the body there. Okay, that's the end of step 21, and it seems like a good place to stop part 3 of the build guide. In part 4 I'm going to be finishing the build, which includes wheels, tyres and body shell amongst other things. But for now, thanks ever so much for watching and I'll see you next time.